I don't really remember anything, obviously, from then, but I do start to remember it maybe at age 5, which would have been 1940. Hello.
Hi. Do you mind if I sit in?
No, yeah.
We're going to save this for
Okay.
Hi, I'm Kip Potts.
Hi, I'm Cheryl Morales.
Cheryl, how are you?
Nice
Nice
to meet you.
And so those memories from the early 40s come back pretty well. And
That's good.
I think probably anybody that's interested in this, the further the memories go back, the better. I think there's probably, there's a few people left around that go back before the causeway, but there are not an awful lot.
No. And fewer all the time.
Yeah, and my recollection in the latter part of the 40s and early 50s is pretty good.
And that's a time frame that we really don't have an awful lot. It's good to have a lot of overlapping. And there just weren't very many people here. So.
Right. Well, there weren't. I mean, it was.
Which is one
it
of the
was
things
pretty sparse between the ferry landing and really Blind Pass. I mean, there were a couple of roads that went off of Sand Cap, but there were precious few. And one that went up to, I think, the Island Inn, and
It's strange that you should mention that now.
and one that went up Tarpon Bay. I mean,
Yeah.
Whoops.
Sorry.
Can I move a little bit?
No, you can wiggle around all you like.
Okay.
And
I mean, or if you don't think that we're faster.
looks pretty good now. Yeah, considering it's...
Let me.
Oh, there's a
to
device
make
there.
a
Just make it perfect.
time and place and all of that. Start this. We're doing an oral history today with Christopher Kip Koss in the Sanibel Library. Today is April the 1st, 1998, and the people here are Kip and Andrea Koss, Jody Brown, Cheryl Morales, and Betty Ann Holt. And we're going to talk both about your grandfather and grandmother, I hope, and about your childhood recollections of the island in the 40s and 50s. And you can just start off.
Well, it was about 1937 when I first came to the island at age 2. My grandfather had been coming since 1935. I don't remember, obviously, a situation when I was 2 years old, but my recollection gets better and better as I get to about 5 years old. So my memories from the early 40s are, I think, pretty accurate. I thought, when I was thinking of talking about this and remembering times since my childhood down here, I thought that maybe I should point out that there were some differences in the times, too. Nowadays, when somebody comes to visit the islands from Ohio or Iowa or Minnesota or Wisconsin, a few hours on the airplane and they're here. And I think some people come for a week, probably a full 2 weeks would be a long visit. But in those days it was quite a chore to get from the upper Midwest down here, a couple days on a train. And the pace of life was different, so that when people came, they might stay for a month or 6 weeks or 2 months, or in the case of Darling, he used to stay the whole winter down here. He did work. It wasn't a vacation. He did it primarily for health reasons because he had terrible bronchitis, and the Midwestern winters used to set him off with a siege of bronchitis. So he was down here essentially from sometime in November, early December until May. At any rate, it was about a 2-day trip down here by train, and the first thing that would happen is you would get to the delightful little Fort Myers Railroad Station, which is now a museum. It is now, and it was particularly then, a very, very attractive station. It was whitewashed, and the bougainvillea crawled all around it, and for somebody from the Midwest in the winter time to arrive and in the morning and see that view was really something. I thought I'd also mention that times were different. I remember at an early age having to go to the bathroom when I just got off the train, and going into the bathroom there, and you know, they had segregated bathrooms. Now, I suppose no telling how long people will be interested in tapes like this, but I can see that 2 or 3 or 4 generations down the pike, the people will have forgotten that sort of thing, and I'm not sure we should forget those things. There were signs on the doors that said colored women, and another door that said white ladies. And I think it said colored men on one door and white gentlemen on another door. So in my earliest recollection, you know, I probably could spell men, but I'd never seen the word gentleman before. So I was off into the wrong bathroom, wrong according to the custom. So I was corrected on that, and being from the Midwest where we didn't have any of that, it was, if nothing else, puzzling. And so often why these signs of those times when bigotry was very common have been covered up. I mean, you know, that probably should be part of the museum in Fort Myers, part of the history, but it's not. It's covered up. So to get on to the islands, if you arrived in the morning and had lunch in Fort Myers, anybody who came to pick you up, that was their one opportunity to do shopping for whatever they needed. So anytime anybody met somebody at the train station, it was an all-day affair where they shopped at Fort Myers. Because it was a long, hard drive to Captiva Island, the paving out of Fort Myers just extended about, well, down most of the way McGregor to where it joins Summerlin now. And the paving ended there, so you had a sand road from the foot of McGregor all the way to the ferry landing. And you had to allow plenty of time because you sure didn't want to miss the ferry. And most people tried to make the last ferry so that they got the maximum time. So it's very critical to allow enough time to get there early enough to catch the last ferry. And of course for a kid, and probably for adults too, it was a very, very exciting way to arrive at the islands. Go across a ferry boat with Captain Leon, and it was an exciting part of the journey. And when you got off at the far end of Sanibel, all of the roads from that point on were sand roads. And when I say sand, they were that washboard sort of thing, and depended on when the county got a grader over here, called Blade, they would be pretty decent roads for a while, maybe a few days, and then they'd get that washboard ripple, and 30-35 miles an hour was really tearing down the road, and it was all the way to Captiva was that way. And there were very few roads off of the Sandcap, off of Periwinkle or then Sandcap Road. And about the only population, there was of course the road that ran down to the old Bailey store, which at that point, when I first started coming here, there were no telephones on the island. I mean, zero telephones. And Bailey's store had a Western Union telegraph. So if there was something really urgent that you had to message to receive or get out, why, was a trip to Bailey's store for communications. And then as you went on down the Sandcap Road, there was really, essentially, there was a road that ran off to the Island Inn, and you made the jog at Tarpon Bay Road, and essentially that was the only population until you reached Blind Pass, and there were the cottages there. And you get over to Captiva, and there wasn't an awful lot there. I imagine, you know, all of those Gulf front properties are a result of subdividing the much larger parcels that existed in those days. And Darling, in those days, in the 30s and the 40s, in fact, his whole period of time down here, he stayed at Tween Waters Inn, which was run by a lovely lady named Grace Price, and she had a young daughter, young in those days, named Dottie, who became Dottie Wakefield. I don't know if that rings a bell to any of you all. Maybe she's done one of these too. And anybody like that you can call on, why, their memories are certainly better and more valuable than mine. But I do have that perspective of, you know, being a sort of a regular comer to the islands and yet not living here. So at any rate, we would go to Tween Waters, and the Darling had the same cottage year after year after year after year. There were cottages all around the main building there where they served meals, and Darling eventually built a studio next to the cottage that he and his wife rented for the season. And his deal with Grace Price was that he would build a studio and use it during his lifetime, and then whenever he stopped coming, why, he would give it to her, and it was on the property there. So the first cottage that you come to, the one closest to the road, was Darling's, and then right behind it, which has since been expanded a fair amount, was a little studio where he worked many hours when he was down here. He did buy a piece of property further on down the island, and that was where he built, which I guess is, I use the word properly, his famous fish house, which he modeled after the fish houses that existed in the bay at that time. The commercial fishermen did, and most of you are familiar with it, at the end of a dock out on pilings. It was a very simple house, one bedroom and one sort of large, tall living room with lofts off of it, and a small dining area and a kitchen, and then this deck that ran all around. I was lucky enough to stay there a couple of winters as a kid, and as a kid, I mean, it was just wonderful. I mean, it was tremendous. I'll tell you how exciting it was for a kid when you'd walk around that railing. From that elevation, you could look down into the water and see all the life. You could see the horseshoe crabs, the stingrays, all of the fish and the life. It was airplane's view, but you could really see down through the water. Darling himself never lived there. His wife, who was called Penny, her real name was Genevieve, she sort of liked that Tween Waters life where they served 3 meals a day, and she was not all that keen on the idea of going and living in the fish house. So they never lived there, but my parents and I did spend, I think, at least 2 winters, maybe more there. You could fish right off of the dock and the deck and this, that, and the other thing. And between the pilings underneath was a U-shaped dock. The dock came out from the shore and sort of formed a horseshoe, and Darling kept a boat underneath there. And he had a small aquarium or fish tank. I should mention that also that he had a nice piece of property on shore, and he was Darling had a lot of skills in a lot of different areas, and one of the things was he was sort of a frustrated botanist, and he had every kind of fruit tree you can imagine, and he would graft those trees and try and come up with new stuff and this, that, and the other thing. And he was also a rather frustrated biologist. He had dug a great pool ashore, well, maybe half the size of this room, a little bigger than that, where he kept all sorts of creatures. And he built a series of impoundments that went pretty much clear across the property, that he was determined that he would be able to breed some of these saltwater fish so that they would adapt to freshwater. And he would start out with a generation in this pool, which was standard saltwater, and then he would progressively move them to less and less salinity. Now, this was a process that took quite a while. Unfortunately, every summer he left and went up to Iowa, and every summer the raccoons would eat the experiment and he would have to start out. Who knows if he would have ever made it, but he was very skilled and knowledgeable in those things, and I remember the great intensity with which he told me as a youngster what he was doing. So he also had driven stakes out there about halfway between the shore and the fish house where he was growing oysters and that sort of thing.
Well, I know that during the late 30s, there was a Tarpon Research Center up at Cabbage Cave, and I wonder if there was some connection with that.
I don't know. The more I find out about Darling and his time here on the islands, from what I read, just recently some letters surfaced. The National Conservation Training Center, which is a new facility in West Virginia, just was dedicated last year. They recently opened a box of archival material that they had received from somewhere, and in it were a bunch of letters that Darling had written in the very early 40s, trying to establish, and these letters are what led to the establishment of what is now the Ding-Darling National Wildlife Refuge. The state owned, I knew that there was lots of ownership of that land, about 5,000 acres at that time that we're talking about. I knew that there was a lot of different ownership. There was some federal, I knew there was some federal land in there, some state land, some private land.
County too, I think.
Excuse me?
County too, I think.
Yes, and county. As it turns out from these letters, it's revealed, and most of these letters are written by Darling to people in the Fish and Wildlife Service and in Tallahassee to the state, to the governor and so calling their attention, trying to awaken a determination to preserve this from development, those lands. even then in the 40s, even though that was still just a ferry boat, that's the only access to the islands, there was becoming a lot of development pressure. And it turns out, having read all the letters and now know more about it, and it turns out that the bulk of the land was state land. And they were getting ready to sell it to developers. You want to guess the price? Huh? 25 cents an acre.
Shades of Diston.
So, now I may have that wrong by 25 cents. Maybe it was 50 cents, but it was down there under $1.
Minnesota land was going for 50 cents an acre at that time.
Well,
So this was probably 25 cents.
it's, so, and he was successful in getting that stopped. The developers raised the price that they were willing to pay to $1.50. But Darling, he had so much clout. To appreciate how much clout he had, you have to stop a minute and think that all of these cartoons that he drew as an editorial cartoonist all of them were before television. And about half of them were before radio, when newspapers were the primary form of communication in the United States, or in the world for that matter. So for him to be syndicated in over 150 newspapers, and some of those newspapers would publish his editorial cartoon on the front page of their paper because it enhanced circulation. Now, an editorial cartoon doesn't belong on the front page of a paper, it belongs in the editorial section, but because his editorial cartoons were so popular, a number of those papers published his cartoon on the front page. Now, this gave him the kind of clout that your prime TV anchor has. I mean, in our day, it was maybe Walter Cronkite. Everybody respected Walter Cronkite, and I don't know who has that same sort of clout now. But so when he would write the governor of the state of Florida, his letters got a lot of attention. And when he would write Washington, it was the same way. And in Washington, if he was writing the Fish and Wildlife Service, since he had been chief of that, his letters got a lot of attention, and he still had close personal contacts there. So he began a campaign and just tying some of these things in. Even back then, in the early 40s, there was an organization on the island that was at times called the Island Conservation Association, times called the Sanibel Captiva Conservation Association. And at the time that he wrote these letters in the early 40s, he was president of that group. So, interesting piece of history. And more of these things in his involvement in things on the islands, more and more that becomes known.
One of the things, too, that I was taken with, I'm interested in red tide in general, and during the 1947 red tide, in the biography, they go into the fact that he was experimenting, dipping up water and experimenting with copper sulfate and a number of things, seeing what was killing it and trying to get scientists down there to look at it before it disappeared. And,
well, he was, the red tide was, first of all, it was obnoxious. And since he had this bronchitis and stuff, he was more sensitive to any of the, we're aware now that these organisms give off an effluence of some kind. It's not just the dead fish that smell badly. And Darling, coincidentally, on our way over today, we were playing some tapes of Darling's dictation. When he was working down here all winter, he was a copious correspondence with people all over the country primarily. Leaders and shakers, many of them, and lots of people who weren't movers and shakers. But he was just a really carried on a lot of correspondence. At any rate, he used to dictate his correspondence down here, if he didn't write the letter longhand, on the old dictabells, which was a plastic sleeve that went around and around, and it was a recording device. And those would slip in an envelope, and he could mail those up to his secretary in Des Moines, and she would transcribe them and then send them to whoever the addressee was. So we were playing some of those that have been moved over to modern cassettes, and it reminded me that in getting to the Red Tide, some of his most interesting correspondence and dictation was he just tore the hell out of the Fish and Wildlife Service for not being more responsive to this problem of the red tide. And those tapes are really something. I mean, he had wonderful friends in the Fish and Wildlife Service, and he respected the people in the Fish and Wildlife Service. But Darling's entire life had been one of being outspoken about things. And when he thought his grandson or somebody else wasn't living up to what he thought they ought to live up to, he was really outspoken, and he just tears the heck out of the Fish and Wildlife Service. And they spent a lot of money, and they got a boat over in the Texas coast somewhere, and Darling said by the time they got the boat bought and got it down here, there wasn't much for them to do. And I think his expression, which he said, a blind man with a pail and a dipper could learn more about red tide, in an hour or two than the Fish and Wildlife Service learned in many a month. So the problem did exist then. I defer to where you want to go with this now.
Well, it is of a piece with his, biological interests.
Mm-hmm.
And also, I think that it's probably very early looking at it scientifically. I don't know when Mote Marine, for example, got into that particular route, but I suspect that he was there earlier.
Well, he was certainly very vocal in agitating for more interest in this. And because of that, and having heard some of the tapes, I've probably done more reading than the average layperson. And not that I know much about it, but the history of red tide goes back, way, way back. I mean, we're talking about 2,000 years or more. And in this day and age where we're so used to instant results and developing knowledge so quickly, it does seem puzzling that they've not been able to really pin down whether it's the nutrients flowing down the Caloosahatchee River that are causing these blooms, or really they just know so little bit about it. And if they've got these high-powered folks researching it and the resources, if the Fish and Wildlife Service would bring all their resources to bear on it, you would think that they would make more progress. But still to date, it's disappointing, and we saw the manatee kill 2 years ago, and sort of puzzling. I think the way of life on the islands in those days is worth mentioning. Darling had so many friends down here, from all walks of life. At Tween Waters, people came for a month or 6 weeks, and a lot of those folks were really very successful, bright people who were very comfortable to be with. They wouldn't have been coming to Captiva if they weren't sort of down-home, comfortable people. I mean, different types of people went to Palm Beach or Miami, but the people that gravitated to Tween Waters and Captiva were sort of the kind of people that you're always comfortable to be with, and it was pretty stimulating for a little kid. The folks on the island were just first class. One of Darling's friends that he admired so much here locally was Belton Johnson, who I think gave you also a history. And Darling and Belton admired each other a great deal, and I remember Belton quite well, and in fact, up till the time he died, I used to drop in, maybe every other year and sit on the porch with him and look out over the Gulf and remember some of these times. The big event of, and I'm sure this sort of rehashes ground that you've heard about a lot, but the only communications really was the mailboat. I mean, that came out to the mail dock every day from Fort Myers, and if you really had something urgent, like maybe you needed a bottle of whiskey or something, you would give the money to and enlist the shopping to the captain of the mailboat, and he'd get it that night after he got back to Fort Myers, and the next day or two, whatever you ordered would show up. It was a great social event too of the island, because that was not all there was to do. I mean, electricity. My earliest memories do include electricity here, but I am aware that it had not been here long. Most of the places like Tween Waters had operated with generators, and still, even in the early 40s, they had to use those generators with some regularity because the power was not very reliable. And the water source was the old cisterns, and that was it. I guess eventually, they bring in bottled water on the mailboat. You see a lot of these big bottles being delivered, but a lot of the water was simply the old cistern. And understand if you ever saw the bottom of one of those cisterns, it would cure you from drinking water for the rest of your life. But
There was
Stick
a
to the
reason
whiskey.
for the whiskey.
Yeah, right. Yeah, kill anything.
Right.
But it was a lot different, and
The appearance of the islands, the vegetation, the not just the fact that there were few people, but also the fact that there was much more prairie land, if you will. And what you did as a child to entertain yourself. Were you on the water in a boat a lot? Were you on the beach?
Did you go to school?
Yeah.
I did go to the school a couple of times. It was now, of course, it's the old schoolhouse theater, and it is the same building. I can vouch for that. My mom was Darling was a stern taskmaster, and so was my mother. And she would go in and see my teachers before we left to come down here, and she would get the books and the assignments, and every single day, I mean, that was it. I mean, if I could do it in an hour or 2 hours, that was fine, but I had to do it every day. And as it turned out, that worked out better. I think it worked out better for me in all ways, and I think it worked out better for my education. My recollection of the couple of days that I went to the old school here was it was not literally, as I recall, a one-room schoolhouse. It was a two-room schoolhouse, right? And there was quite a spread in the number of children, the different ages and classes and this, that, and the other thing. And two things about it. Of course, I hated to be tied up at school all day when I was down here, because as you was asked, what did I do? Well, there were great adventures for a young boy to have. here on the island, and I sure didn't want to spend my days in the school, and I suspect that the answer is that with my mom giving me all her attention for that hour or two or whatever it was, I don't think it was ever more than 2 hours, I probably learned a lot more each day than I would in the two-room schoolhouse with all its distractions and the fact that there wasn't that much attention.
How many months out of the year would you spend here, your family?
Well, I was fortunate because my father was in the construction business in the Midwest, and there's not a lot of construction in the wintertime. So I'd say that probably it was about 6 weeks, 4 weeks occasionally. And then the Second World War came along, and that sort of botched up those plans. I think we still managed to get down here for a week or so. My dad was in the service, but he was not overseas, and when he could get away, why? But it wasn't that month or 6 weeks during the war. It was a shorter period. But there was, you know, you asked Betty about the activities. In those days, you didn't have to be a very good fisherman to catch fish. There was quite a variety of fish, and there were quite a number of them. So I could go down off the Tween Waters dock with one of those old cane poles. And that's my first recollection of fishing down here, was with one of the cane poles. And no telling what you'd pull off. Right there at Tween Waters dock. I mean, it might be a little snapper, it might be a grouper, it might be a redfish, it might, no telling what it would be. Of course, it was the mailboat thing. When you would walk up along the road, in those days there weren't many people here, so you would wind your way past the houses that lined Captiva Road, I guess you call it. And then there was a real jungle from what was in those days the Loomis house, about where Belton Johnson lived. The path ran behind approximately where Belton's house was, down to the old post office. And now, I was a little kid, so things looked bigger to me in those days than maybe they would now, but I can remember walking with a delightful man whose name was Kent Curtis, who's probably his name has come into some of these things. Kent Curtis was I think he ended up, or sometime in his life, had run a boys' camp. You know, a wonderful way with children and a wonderful imagination. And I can remember walking to the post office with Kent Curtis, and we'd be walking down through the jungle, and he would reach behind after I'd gone by and grab a palm frond or something and let it go. And must have been a snollygoster. So a walk to the post office with Kent Curtis was worth remembering. You know, delightful. And so there was that. And then in later years, after Andy Rossi built his facility there, the mailboat used to go up to Andy's dock after it stopped at the post office. And if you were really adventuresome and really looking for some more socializing, you would walk up and, or maybe you could ride on the mailboat. I remember walking up there to Andy's dock, and Andy's dock was, I mean, you know, this was real entertainment to go to Andy's dock.
The social center.
Yeah, it really was, and
Neighborhood.
it was a neighborhood and you know, rich in everything you could think of, so that was a big, that killed the mornings, and at Tween Waters they'd serve lunch, and then they had a dinner bell that they rang at luncheon time, and Darling had a big table because he had a big family, and things moved along pretty well throughout the day. And then as a way of life, it's sort of interesting. Tween Waters had dinner every night. Well, the civilized people all had cocktails at 5 o'clock, and the dinner bell rang at 6 or 6:30. And people had dinner there, and then afterwards, I mean, there was no television, you know. So it was either Chinese checkers or bridge or whatever, and that was the end of a long, busy day for a kid.
Did you go over to Buckhead? Did you go exploring that? sort of thing?
We did, and I'm sure somebody's mentioned Old Man Futz that
Mhm.
lived over there. Well, that was really something. They mentioned him in detail and that sort of.
In the Tales of Old Captivity.
Yeah.
Yes.
Well, he was for real. He really was, and his wife, and they lived over there, and they had a small, I don't know whether you could call it a farm. They had a few animals like hogs, and I guess a small garden. Tween Waters used to send their garbage over there with regularity. And when he was healthier, when he was younger, I think Mr. Futz used to row over a sort of a scow-like rowboat
Okay.
and take the garbage, because that's what he fed the hogs. And he'd row back there. Now that was, I mean, I couldn't go on a trip like that because he was going back and he wasn't going to row that big old
Right.
rowboat back to drop somebody off. But when he got older, one of the helpers, one of the employees, for instance, at Tween Waters, would take a rowboat. They'd put the garbage on and take it over to Mr. Futz and his wife, and I got to go along on some of those trips, which was pretty exciting. And of course, we used to fish down there in Roosevelt Channel, and there was in those days still, which still exists today, that little sort of little bay where you go back onto the key, and
Hurricane Bay, I think.
Hurricane Bay, and you know, if you were adventuresome, you could get through the mangroves there. And in the very early years, there were oysters grew on all the mangroves in Roosevelt Channel. I mean, they were thick. And when you wanted oysters, you could go there and knock off an oyster and go back and have oysters on the half shell. The water was that good. And that stopped somewhere, I guess, by the end of the 40s. People didn't want to eat oysters anymore up there, and eventually they all died anyway.
Did you see Cuban fishing smacks offshore?
No, I did not. But there was, during the Second World War, there was quite a bit of activity. And, see, I would have been 7 or 8 years old where this was all very exciting to me. I do recall that at least one winter down here that they were very serious about the blackouts at that time. I mean, very careful about lights. And there was at least one, if not several more, big Army Air Corps, it was the Army Air Corps in those days, training fields on the mainland. And they used to come out and just bomb the heck out of targets out in the ocean. And also, I think somebody's probably told you, and I can't tell you for sure, was it
The Wolford area, Bowman's Beach area
Beach.
was.
Okay, well, they had several target
Flowers.
areas.
Mhm.
And they used to drop bombs and this, that, and the other thing out there for practice, and occasionally you could tell, I mean, it would kill fish, I mean, or a porpoise, or whatever. There was a heck of a concussion, and occasionally something would wash ashore, and I can remember when a porpoise washed ashore, and that was the general conclusion, that it had been killed by concussion, that sort of thing. And then Dottie Price Wakefield, one of those young Army aviators, fell in love with her, and he used to come over Tween Waters, and perhaps others did too, but I think Johnny Wakefield came over a little lower than anybody else, and it was pretty exciting because he came over low enough that you would put your nose down in the sand to avoid
You
it.
could recognize his face.
Just about, and of course, and then I'm sure people have told you they used to deliver the newspapers. Well, can you imagine being a 7-year-old kid and at 6:30 or something like that, somebody's gonna fly over and drop the newspapers? I mean, it was really exciting, you know.
Gotta be there.
And that was Buddy Bobst, was his name. And Buddy Bobst eventually gave me seaplane flying lessons. When I was a lot older, I had gotten my pilot's license, but I'd never flown a seaplane. So I got lessons from Buddy Bobst one year down here. And I believe Buddy taught Andy Rossi's son, Charles? Charles. Got a pilot's rating and seaplane rating on Charles. He was quite a character.
Tell me a little bit about your grandmother as well.
Oh, my grandmother. Well, that's sort of fun because, you know, Ding Darling. I'm not avoiding your question, but you to appreciate Mrs. Darling, Penny. Ding Darling was a big guy. Now I don't know how tall he was, but he was 6'1" or 2 or 3 or something like that. And in those days, that was a big guy, and big frame. And his wife, I think if she stood on her tiptoes, she might make 5 foot. So she was particularly compared to him, a little tiny sprite. And she was a very bright gal. I think they had met in Sioux City, Iowa. They were both from Sioux City. And she, pretty sure, had graduated from the University of Chicago. Now in the late 1800s. That was fairly unusual for a woman to have that education. So she was, in her own right, a very bright, intelligent gal. And the problem was that her husband was so well known, and people wanted to talk to him. I mean, there were two sides to it. One, they wanted to talk to him intellectually, I suppose, but they also wanted to talk to him in the same way you might want to talk to a movie star to see what they're like or flesh and blood. So he got all the attention and she got very little, which I think must have exasperated her from time to time, because she really, in her own right, was, you know, she could hold her own. They had a lot of fun together. They traveled a lot. Darling had such a curiosity about absolutely everything. I mean, something at his feet. I remember with Christy Seaman Anders one day, first time I met her, she was leading a little Christy Seaman Anders was leading a group through the refuge, and many years ago, and I just happened to tag along, or was out on wildlife drive and sort of joined this group because, you know, a good naturalist is just such a pleasure to be around. You learn so much from him, and Christy is one of the very best. So I sort of tagged along, and we came to that little walk that goes out to the bay, the little wooden walk. And she was taking this group out there, and she looked down in the water and saw some sort of creature. And she stopped right there, and she ran around, backed off the dock, and ran down there and picked up this creature. And I mean, it was I can't remember what creature it was right now, but it was not really what would interest, you know, somebody who wasn't interested in that sort of thing. It was a slimy slug or something like that. But boy, Christy wanted to show that to those people. And so she got this thing, and she's cupped it in her fingers, and she's showing it to all these people. And afterwards I told her, I said, that really tickled me because, I mean, that's sure what Ding Darling would have done. I mean, if he saw something, he'd go to. I said the only difference is he probably would have taken out his pocket knife. If it was dead, he would have taken out his pocket knife and sliced it open to see what it had been eating. And it really touched Christy because I'm sure she'd sliced open a lot of things that she'd found that were dead to see what they'd been eating. So it was really fun. Well, I don't know what got me off on that, but Mrs. Darling was a bright gal, and Ding was curious about everything, whether it was right at his feet or whether it was to go see how the New Zealanders live or how the Russians live or this, that, and the other thing. In fact, one of the books he wrote was Ding Goes to Russia. And he was just curious to go over there and see how this system was working after the Russian Revolution. And if you've read the book, which I gather you have, some of the predictions he made came true. Just he didn't say that he knew when they were going to happen, just that they were going to happen, and they did happen. And Mrs. Darling liked to travel a lot. And the picture you've shown me here of the of Mr. Darling on one side and Mrs. Darling on the far side, and the lady in the middle is Alice O'Brien. And they were fond friends. And Alice O'Brien was also a very, very competent lady who ran a very large company in Minnesota. I think it was lumber. Does that ring a bell? Paper.
I think that may be so.
But she had taken the company over when her father couldn't run it anymore, and her brother simply did not have the talent that she did. And they were fond friends. And one of the tapes I heard, I just think it's a little personal touch, which I enjoyed very much. Darling is writing somebody, and he's just heard that Alice O'Brien is in the hospital. And apparently it was not the first time she was in the hospital. She'd been suffering from health problems, and whoever had written Darling, probably a lady named Phoebe Peabody, who lived up in that area too and spent her winters down here in the States. Probably Phoebe had written, but whoever had written her said that she was suffering in the hospital. And Darling writes back to whoever he was writing, and he says, I was really sorry to hear about Alice. And then in his very outspoken way, he says, it makes you wonder who's running this operation anyway. And he said, it's very clear to me that they don't know what the hell they're doing. I mean, he'd tangle with the good Lord himself if he didn't think that something was fair. And that was one thing that he was very, very much in for fairness, and he didn't like it at all that this woman that he respected a great deal was suffering. He let it be known. That's a good picture. That's wonderful.
Now, my understanding is that her boat, which she navigated, and she was a mechanic, number of talents.
She was a bright gal, and she was very experienced, actually, and she knew boats very well. I think that Darling was in part way responsible for eventually Alice hired Belton Johnson as her captain. And for many, many years, and I think through at least 2 boats, maybe more, Belton was the captain. And
that may be why Belton went to Captiva from Sanibel. Because his father farmed right in this area here. No wonder.
I don't know that I think the reason that I heard, and I suppose somebody could check the deeds or something like that. I heard that Darling had bought the piece of property that Belton's house was on Captiva, and had given it to Belton. I can't tell you where I got that. I think I got it from Belton, but I'm not sure of that. I'm sure I got it from Belton. One of those days sitting there on the porch and telling me about that. And that's why that would probably be the main reason he was there. I don't know whether he commuted from Sanibel when he was working for Alice O'Brien, but those were fine. I still guess they would be called boats rather than ships, but they were very substantial boats.
Yeah.
And she was one of them was confiscated at the beginning of the Second World War.
Yeah, that's what I was thinking too. I had heard
Yeah,
that.
and then she was more interested, for instance, in having a sturdy boat like that. She had one boat built at some boatyard in Minnesota that was absolutely modeled on shrimp trawlers. I mean, it was a real sturdy, ocean-going type of boat, and the lines of it were just the same lines as the shrimp trawlers you see, and that sort of thing. And, Belton did that. I guess it's long enough after his death and Darling's death. There was Alice O'Brien used to bring her boat back and forth from Minnesota every winter. And one year it ran up on a mud flat in the Mississippi. Now Belton had done this many, many years, but Belton's pride was such, and maybe you've heard this, that was it. He hung it up. And of course anybody that I think that's navigated the Mississippi more than once, you might get away with once or twice without going aground, but you wouldn't do it for forever without going aground, and he'd done it pretty much forever, I guess, and it was a very sad way to end because nobody held it against him, but Belton held it against himself. And that's the kind of guy he was. I mean, he had very, very high standards for himself, and that's the way those people were in those days. I mean, there was none of this easy off stuff. I mean, you had responsibilities and accountability, and they demanded a lot of themselves, and I think that's why they were so productive.
I wonder what he would think of the restoration of the Kissimmee River, the de-channelization, if you will. I know he wasn't fond of the Army Corps of Engineers.
Oh, well, that's an understatement.
Yeah.
Well, I think I say with some confidence that he would be just absolutely delighted.
He was attuned to rivers in general.
He was attuned to rivers in general. He was attuned to ecology, conservation. He was very, very much aware of the interaction between habitat, species.
I'm thinking also of siltation with the channelization, the things that have happened to Florida Bay and of course the Keys.
Right, right. No, I think he'd be absolutely delighted with that, and I think he would have been absolutely delighted when they finally put a stop to building these dams. Although probably, pragmatically speaking, the greatest impact on the amount of dams being built was probably because they built every damn dam they could that was economically feasible. I mean, you have to have certain conditions to build a dam for it to be financially feasible. And in the great era of dam building in the United States, I think they built about every one they could. not entirely, but that was probably a bigger impact than the conservationists. Yeah, he'd be real happy with that. And he was not. He got an awful lot of honors during his lifetime, but he did not. He was simply not the kind of guy that placed much stock in that. I mean, you know, if he completed a long, arduous project, I mean, the day it was completed, that was forgotten, and it was the next one that he was interested in. And as a result, he did not, or sort of not as a result, but coincident with that, he really did not place much value on awards and that sort of thing. And in fact, the few that still remain in the family, my mother typically dug out of the trash to save them. I mean, he just really didn't care. And in fact, when he was getting one very prestigious award as a conservation award, he said, you know, he said, giving awards to conservationists, he says, is like giving medals to generals who only lose wars. So but the reason I linger on that is because I think he would be pleased to have that refuge named after him. It meant a lot. The refuge itself meant a lot to him, and he put a lot of work in to do it. And he was in fact despite some of his hard jabs at the Fish and Wildlife Service, for instance, on the red tide, he was a very, very respectful of the individuals in the Fish and Wildlife Service who did on-the-ground work and that sort of thing. And one other thing that I know he treasured, and this I can say with confidence, I'm just speculating on the refuge thing, but I do know that at some point he was given years after he had been chief of the Biological Survey, which became the Fish and Wildlife Service, years later he was given a Fish and Wildlife agent's badge and a little leather wallet or something like that. And now that was something he held on to. That was very important to him. I still have it, and I'm going to give it to the Fish and Wildlife Service before we're done. We'll either go up in the National Conservation Training Center in West Virginia or the refuge in the new Center for Education.
Tommy Wood and his relationship with him.
Tommy Wood and Ding Darling were fond friends of each other. And
did he fly with him?
Oh yes, yeah. In fact, I think I'm the only one in the family who didn't fly with Tommy, and I don't know why that is, because I would have loved to fly with Tommy. I think those years, because by the time I got to be about somewhere in my mid-teens, I was not getting back every year, and several years would go by. But they were great. Darling really admired Tommy Woods, and it was a mutual sort of thing, and they spent a lot of time together. I know they flew together, and that of course was about the time that Charles LaBeouf came on the scene. Was just about the last time Darling was on the island. But I think Darling felt like he knew Charles pretty well because Tommy Woods had talked about it. And so I remember that Darling had some feeling, I'm pretty sure I'm right on this, that he felt that Charles should have really followed on as refuge manager after Tommy retired. And of course the Fish and Wildlife Service is a very large organization, and they have rules about who has to enlist and what kind of education you have to have and everything like that. But Charles was kind of hands-on, hard-working guy, that had the right instincts. And I remember Darling expressing some real disappointment that Charles had not been doing that job.
When they came by a trailer, was it only that one year? Did he give it up right after that?
You know, I really don't know. I do know that in Des Moines, you know, I was a child of the Depression. Things were pretty tight about the time I was born, and my parents moved into Darling's studio, which was right next door to his large house in Des Moines. So I saw a fair amount of Ding Darling as a kid, and I remember when that trailer was parked outside of his house. But I never rode in it, and I can't even tell you what year it was. And I don't remember it down here, so I would guess that he only did it once, and that was enough for him.
I kind of got that feeling.
I think so. And Darling might have been willing to put up with it, but I don't think my grandmother would have been able to. And you know, it wasn't interstate highways in those days either. It was something like that.
Did you always take the train down when you came, or did you ever?
I always
drive?
did. I always did. And I mean, in many later years, I mean, after the causeway was built and stuff like that, I think my parents maybe drove it once or something like that. And Darling probably drove it once or twice himself. I think that he probably, when I say this as an educated guess, he probably had a car driven down from Des Moines, but he probably came on the train almost invariably. Yeah, that was sort of, well, I'm sure they did it occasionally, but it wasn't very often.
So he would have a car here.
He had a car here, and I remember probably was the mid-40s, maybe a little later. Darling had become sort of hard of hearing, and I remember this as a young boy because it was sort of exciting to get in the car with my grandfather because he couldn't hear the engine very well. Of course, those were the days before automatic transmissions. So in order to hear enough the engine that he was used to when he first became sort of hard of hearing, he'd really rev it up. I mean, you know, and then he'd pop the clutch out. So the car would take off. Like, it was pretty exciting riding with him. Because, he was a good driver. He was a good operator of machinery and this sort of thing. But he wasn't getting the clues about how many RPMs he was turning, and eventually got used to it and adjusted to it. But I probably was around probably the first time he really did start to lose some hearing on that. And I remember it was pretty exciting leaving Tween Waters. Of course, you were on sand again, so it wasn't like being on pavement. You know, and the sand would spit out behind the car, and off we'd go.
Well, his first trip to Florida was pre-1900, and what
Pre-19.
the pre-1900 is what I picked up out of one of these books. But
Oh, okay, all right.
before
Okay,
the
before
turn of
Tween
the
Waters and
century.
that sort of thing.
Well, I don't know that it was to Captiva. I
No,
don't believe
no.
so. But what drew him here to begin with? Was it the birds, the conservation aspects, or what attracted him here to begin with?
I suspect it was word of mouth. My understanding is that Mrs. Price, Mr. Price had started a fish camp at what became Tween Waters. And he had died at a fairly young age. And Mrs. Price, Grace Price, then gradually built it into Tween Waters. And I know that far as I can tell, the first time he came and stayed at Tween Waters was 1935, and he was hooked from the first time. But I can't tell you what was the occasion for that first trip. If I'll remember to tell you if I come across it.
Okay.
The health aspect.
Well, I think he knew he had to come.
South.
Yeah, he had to come south.
From Iowa, why your choices are Florida or Arizona. It's about the same
Yes,
distance.
yes, right.
But the fishing and the birds are the wildlife.
Sure,
Here,
I,
more than
it makes
elsewhere.
sense, but I just don't have any
Yeah.
inside, I might find some information on that. I still have a lot of the old records, correspondence, and this, that, and the other thing, and I might come across it, but,
It may be the wetlands in general, you know, if you're
could be.
saying
All of these things,
Arizona
yeah,
versus.
all of
Yeah.
these
Mhm,
things
mhm.
make sense, but somebody had to tell him about it
Right.
first.
Mhm.
And I don't know who did or what the occasion was that would have come about. He sure loved it, though.
Mhm. Yeah, that's one of the things I have heard it said, and I've seen two different sides of it. When he left the island a few years before his death, some people said he got disgusted with what was happening on the island.
Mhm.
Some people said, no, it was simply his son's illness.
Mhm.
And it sounded to me that it was more being torn away from the island than it was a matter of a pox on you.
No question about that.
Okay.
Because it was, his son's illness was weighed heavily on his mind, and particularly on Mrs. Darling's mind. Ding Darling himself was a pretty pragmatic guy, and they had just about tried every single thing over a long period of time with his son John. And I think that Ding Darling he took a lot of knocks in his life. I mean, we know he had a lot of successes, but he took some knocks over the years too. And he was just not a guy that would, say, woe is me, or woe is me because of my son, or something like that. He just was pretty pragmatic about things. But Mrs. Darling was particularly keen. I don't think I know she never gave up hope that somehow the situation with her son John would improve. Absolutely never gave up hope and faith that was true. And so he was just north of Clearwater, so that became more and more the trips to Clearwater, and then eventually they would spend half of the winter season in Clearwater, and then eventually it was the whole season. But I just finished, as I said, listening to some tapes on the way over from the Miami area today, and they're tapes from 1953. In the winter of 1953, Darling, I don't know whether it was 52, the winter of 52, 53, or 53, 54, but thereabouts. The dates are, well, it would have been the winter of 52, 53, because the tapes that I'm listening to are early spring of 53. They spent that winter in the Canary Islands, Majorca. And his letters to friends and on the islands, I mean, to the Grulans, to the Hayfords, Max and Jean Hayford, to Parker Mills. Parker Mills. That's something I should tell you if you don't know. Do you know about the Captive Island story?
Yeah.
You do?
But the pin and.
Oh, yes.
But
Well,
you tell.
Tell the story, please.
Yes.
Well, I don't know I don't know all the details of it, but as I said, Darling was staying at Tween Waters, and you really didn't need much more than staying. I mean, they fed you, and what else do you need? A roof over your head and that sort of thing. But Darling did buy the piece of property, built the fish house, and he had a studio in that orchard that I described. And or fruit, fruit trees were. And he became painfully aware. One, you couldn't buy anything on Captiva. You couldn't buy a tank of gas. You couldn't buy a sandwich. You couldn't buy an egg. You couldn't buy anything. So Darling bought some property and built the Captiva Island store, which was right there at Andy Rossi Lane and whatever the cross streets are. And so I just doubt that, I don't know who knows, anybody I guess that's listened to your history, but I just don't think many of the people know that store, which still sits there today, Ding Darling built that. And he did it because he just thought you ought to be able to buy something on Captiva, and he even put in a gas pump. And now all of these things, Darling never made a penny off of them. I mean, he subsidized these things. He had a very good income, and he was always a very generous person. He was particularly generous when it was a project that he believed in. I mean, you may have heard that he funded the Cooperative Wildlife Research Units, the first one of those, entirely out of his own pocket. He was generous with people, and generous with Belton as an example, really generous. And so he subsidized that thing, and from the correspondence about it, he was always taking gas, and he was always having to dig in his pocket to make the thing stay afloat a little longer, and that sort of thing. But that sort of tickles me. And you find out these things. I had a fellow about 2 weeks ago called me from Des Moines, Iowa. He was a conservationist, probably in his 70s, and a historian. And he was so excited. They are building a greenway, a parkway, all the way from Des Moines down to it goes along the river, quite a ways to a lake. It's an artificial lake. And there's a park there in Des Moines that's going to be part of the greenway. And this guy called me to tell me that Ding Darling had given this land to the city for the park. And I thought, guys, I don't know where he got that. Well, it turns out he's a real serious historian, because he not only sent me the documentation, he sent me a copy of the deed where Genevieve and J. N. Darling signed this property over to the city of, a quitclaim deed to the city of Des Moines. And the reason the guy was calling me was really not to tell me that particular fact, but that they wanted to name the greenway the Ding Darling Greenway. And what did I think about that? Well, I thought it was fine. They had then he followed up with some minutes of a meeting that had been held, that they had all sorts of people. But then he sent the documentation. I thought that was really something. But he was always doing things like that. That just nobody ever, I mean, I don't think he ever told anybody. He didn't tell anybody in the family. Obviously his wife knew, but his children didn't know. His grandchildren didn't know. Most of us had talked a little bit about that, I think. But he did. Keep finding these things in
It's the fascinating part.
Well, it is. It is. And I'm afraid I'll be very brief, because I don't think this particularly has a place on your oral history. But probably going back a year ago, a fellow called me, is doing a biography on Ding Darling's brother, Frank Darling.
Okay.
I thought, well, that's real interesting. wonder if this guy's got his wires crossed, because I remember my Uncle Frank, granduncle Frank, but I wouldn't have, he was a wonderful, delightful man. And the family lore was that he had built the world's finest roller coaster. He was, I thought, an engineer, and that he'd made and lost several fortunes during his lifetime. That was sort of the family lore. Well, it turns out that he was a very accomplished guy and played instrumental roles in things like, it wasn't that he built roller coasters, he designed the 1939 World's Fair.
Oh.
And then had played a big part in the Rockefellers' restoration of Colonial Williamsburg.
Okay.
And he was really valued in that kind of, in this day, you'd say he built amusement parks, I guess. I know certainly doesn't fit Colonial Williamsburg, but that sort of thing. And this guy was an expert in that sort of thing. Quote, Disneylands or amusement parks or whatever. And he says that Ding Darling's brother, Frank, was the, right up there in the category of like Walt Disney and Disney World sort of thing. And how he really believes it. Turned out he was a heck of a historian. He was a real historian. I mean, I can't imagine the stuff he had done. And he had gone and spent like 2 years at Williamsburg going through all of their archives. Had the correspondence between the Rockefellers. So being an historian is fascinating.
It
So,
is.
yeah. Excuse the aside, but I thought.
No, that's
good, yeah.
interesting. Yeah.
Well, I'm sure I'll think of incidents and anecdotes later that are of interest, but that sort of covers it, I think.
It's been very interesting.
It's fun. I have one other little story to tell about what is now the Darling Refuge, and that is that when I was a kid, Ding Darling and Belton Johnson used to go out there. Now, I mean, we're talking about a real jungle. And they would, in essence, crawl through the jungle back to the base, and to count roseate spoonbills and sort of thing like that. And they would be gone like the whole day. And I mean, the excitement that when he would come back and he said, I saw roseate spoonbills. And he kept track of that sort of thing. And he would make his own bird counts and that sort of thing. And I remember as a little boy, I used to be pretty impressed, because when he came back from one of those days, I mean, he looked like he'd been through the war, And remember, they didn't have mosquito control and stuff like that in those days. And
pick up the mud.
yeah, it was just, it was really something. And he and Belton occasionally go out and try and get an alligator. And they'd take a big old long pole, and one guy'd stand above the bank above the alligator hole, and the other guy'd stand out there and push the pole in there and sort of thing like that. And the great tragedy, as far as I was concerned, was that they thought I was too little to go. I guess, alligator bait.
Yeah.
And
So you were probably just the right size.
I guess I'm thankful that.
Put him on the end of that pole.
Now, in these day and age, I guess I'm glad that I didn't go, but it sure did crush me in those days, because I obviously thought I was certainly big and strong enough to do that.
Yeah, I watched an alligator catch a tarpon yesterday in the pond.
Oh,
across
really?
from our house, and that was impressive.
Oh.
The tarpon it's a landlocked pond, it's off of the Sanibel River. And the tarpon was about this long, with the gator is about a 10-foot gator that hangs around.
Ah.
And he's cruising around the pond with the.
Boy, that
It
must
was-
have been exciting.
Yeah, that was fun to watch. But
Wow.
you didn't want to get too close. You could tell
No.
how agitated he was before he actually caught him.
And you could tell by his behavior that he was
something
looking
was going on. We were
he was
watching.
looking for something.
Yeah.
Well, the birds seem to be pretty good at telling whether the alligators.
Yeah, they'll stand right next to him
Yeah.
a lot of the
Mhm.
time, but they know when to leave. I had another thought. Dr. Louise Perry in
Mhm.
the 1930s, 40s, really up into the 50s, did they have any interaction? She was basically interested in the shells and that sort of thing, but she was a naturalist in general,
Yes,
and I wonder.
I remember the name very well, and I think I remember the person. I rather a
Older
slight
woman.
but slight brunette. I mean,
Okay.
if I'm thinking the right person. And did she not have a house, would have been north of Rossi's, Andy Rossi's dock?
No, she lived on Sanibel.
She lived
near
on
Castle
Sanibel.
Hill. But there might have been connections up there.
The
where she would have
Perrys,
stayed.
uh,
She was a medical doctor, and she and her husband came to the island first, actually in the teens. So she was
mhm.
considerably. I don't.
But in the 50s, she was living in the Catskill area.
Right.
Hmm. Well, I'm pretty sure that I know
But
who
slender,
that was.
certainly. I
Yeah.
have no idea of her height. I've never
Yeah.
seen her,
Yeah, just.
never seen a
Uh,
picture of her standing next to anybody.
I'm pretty sure I remember her. There was another woman who was also a naturalist who had a very interesting house a few doors north of Tween Waters. The Spanish architecture was I think her name was Alice Miner. And
That
the
sounds
miners
right.
were
Yeah.
the miners were from Chicago, and she was a very keen naturalist. And either she or her husband was a biologist, I believe. They obviously did something very successful in Illinois, if I've got my memories correct. And but I do remember the name, but and there was some interaction. And Darling just had this interaction with all these people, locals and people from up north.
Which makes things very creative.
It was really sort of fun.
Yeah.
Alan and Skipper Weeks had a house that was just north of the fish house. And then you wouldn't recognize South Seas Plantation, I'll tell you. My memories of that.
Yeah.
That was really pretty scuffy
Yeah.
back in those days. Yeah, but which was everything was. I mean, everything was.
Yeah.
And,
Yeah, there wasn't a whole lot of polish.
no,
anywhere.
there wasn't, and but they did wear a tie for dinner at Queen Waters, which was. I don't think you'd find a tie in there anymore, but in those days it was sort of like Mad Dogs and Englishmen, you know.
Yeah.
We have pictures at the Historical Museum of gentleman Gordon Shelley wearing a tie.
Mm.
And a hat.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Well, and Darling's caricatures, you know, of the Shellers, aren't those wonderful?
Aren't they?
Yeah.
Aren't they
Oh,
precious?
just,
Yes.
Just great stuff.
Yeah. Are you thinking in terms of maybe putting his letters together or something like that?
Alls I need is about 36 hours in every day,
Yeah.
and I do it.
It would be fascinating.
Well, I'd like to do it, because one of the things, you know, if you're a serious historian, there's a wonderful, I mean, there's shelves and shelves and shelves of his correspondence, to and from. His secretary kept a copy of the stuff he sent out, but the incoming stuff, the special collections at the University of Iowa has a wonderful collection of the significant correspondence on conservation and this, that, and the other thing. The one thing the family called out, well, first of all the purely personal letters, they called those out. And they also called out those letters that had reflections on people living or whose immediate family was still living. Because again, he could be pretty outspoken, and he called a spade, and
Yeah, uh-huh.
and the family just felt, well, there's no sense offending somebody.
Right.
And I think it's been long enough now. Most of those letters, I'm afraid, were discarded, but I still have the personal letters, and they're wonderful because Darling, to be an editorial cartoonist or political cartoonist, you have to have, you obviously conjure up an image. And when he wrote, he did the same thing. And he was a great, great writer. He had a great command of the English language. And I don't know how much of his actual writing you've read, but he was an excellent writer. He gave a speech that was, when he gave a speech, it was worth listening to because his allegories are just wonderful. And he made his points with, in effect, visual images. So, and the letters between his daughter and him are touching. So yes, I would like to do that. The project, besides the Darling Foundation and the Refuge and a good number of other things that I'm involved in because of the Darling Foundation, we have been working, and I guess I should say I've been working for, I'm afraid now it's over 10 years, trying to pull together, to scan all of these cartoons that he did during his lifetime and pull them together on